So we're here to discuss the question which Stewart's work provokes in us. Can humans plan for the long term? If humans have to live in a long term or a long now, can they plan for it? And I have to say that the historical record suggests no. And in fact, the historical record suggests that humans have been systematically planning for the future less over the past couple of centuries than they used to, because humans have come to the, in part, correct conclusion that markets are pretty good for doing things and distributing things, and you don't have to do stuff that people used to do in terms of planning for the future. So, for instance, people don't, by and large, these days, build very large fortifications that they think will stand for hundreds of years, things like that. There's less planning for the future than there was. The market is part of that. Of course, the fact that over the course of the 20th century, some economies that indulge in long-term planning did really rather badly is another part of the same example. There's another problem. When people did, to some extent, elites at least to some extent, plan for the long term, they tended to do so on the basis that the long term was going to be like the now, and we live in a world today where it's very obvious that that's not the case. And so given all that, why should we bother to talk about planning for the long term at all? And the answer is the great aphorism of Dwight Eisenhower, that plans are useless, but planning is vital. And to give a homely little example of this, and something suggested to me over breakfast, can I have my first slide, please? This is the first slide with something on it. Yeah, there we go. This is the dull bit of my job. This is a plan for what's going to happen in The Economist over the next 6 weeks. But because some of you work for other publications, these are actually the next 6 weeks as of last breakthrough. This is a document that I sent from this very place last year back to London, because that's part of what I do. I marshal out the future. And so there you can see what we thought we were going to do. And next slide, please. And here's what we actually did. And so you can see that in some cases we were right. You know, the next week we actually did do the thing on Netflix. The week after that, and this has been a thing about weeks recently, the distinctive profile of Donald Trump intervened, and plan goes out the window. Then we're back on track. Then, again, news intervenes, and Belt and Road gets pushed back, and climate and India gets pushed back. But what this shows you is that I wouldn't be able to do my job if I didn't at least have the plan, even though when it came down to it, only one of the 5 out weeks actually worked out where I expected it to be. The other thing you learn from this is that our brilliant cover designer, Graham, has a penchant for things that slope down by about 30 degrees to one side. Because, interestingly, that is also a way of denoting that the story is bad news. Good news stories go up in the same direction. So you can see that there. So what this shows us is that there are various ways for planning to fail. There's addition, when either exogenously or endogenously new stuff comes up. There's subtraction, when stuff goes away. And there's straightforward time shifting. I have no idea whether that typology is going to be useful in what follows, but I thought I'd at least offer it up. Before turning the floor over to the first of our 3 speakers, I don't think I'm going to stand up here and introduce them all individually, but who knows? I haven't really thought it through, which is partly the message of the meeting. Our first speaker is Alan Sanfey. Alan looks at cognition, human behavior, how people think, psychology, stuff like that. He's at Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, and he's going to speak about why thinking about the future is kind of difficult for people.
Thank you, Oliver. I'm a brain scientist, and you may be wondering why I'm here, as I've wondered myself on occasion this morning. And although I wouldn't presume to inform you or tell you about anything involving technology or climate or environment, ultimately all of the policies that you so carefully work on and the technologies you develop typically have to be enacted by humans, and whether that's kind of large-scale policy formulations by governments or by individuals themselves enacting change in useful ways. And this is often where the rubber meets the road, as they say, and where things can often grind to a halt, or at least be unpredictable. That people behave in unpredictable ways, and people's decision-making isn't often as sensible and logical and rational as the models and the policies, and as we would like to think they are. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the quirks of human decision-making behavior. I'll just illustrate a few with some examples and hopefully provoke your thinking about how this is I think, a very important aspect to understanding how we can develop policies for helping with the important issues we're going to study. So, broadly speaking, my work looks at a kind of a constellation of disciplines where we take from psychology, neuroscience, economics, amongst others, in order to try and better understand human decision-making. And obviously we're going to try and answer the question, what motivates our choices? Why do we decide the way we do? Clearly we don't decide in accordance with, say, standard economic models. We decide based on not arbitrary, but different principles. And I'm going to give a few examples to hopefully illustrate that today. So these are the kind of examples we would study in the laboratory, and also we'd place people in brain scanners and get a sense of how the neural architecture is working. We give people simple choices like this, right? You'd come into our lab and we tell you, you can choose option A, where I'm going to give you a fair coin. You can flip it. If it lands on heads, I'm going to give you $1,000. Our research budget's a little bit more limited, but for purposes of today, I'm going to give you $1,000. If it lands on tails, however, I'm going to give you nothing. Or you can choose option B, in which case I'm just going to give you $500 for sure, without any necessity of coin flipping. So let's have a quick show of hands. So who here would choose option A? Who wants to flip the coin in this example? There's always a few risk takers who enjoy the thrill. Who would choose option B? Who would pick option B? Okay, so thankfully you guys are like every other audience I've ever given this example to, and the vast majority pick option B. So this is interesting. This starts to allow us to probe the kind of the decision-making system. It's not so difficult to see from a purely economic perspective. These two are equal in what we might call expected value. If you played option A over and over and over again, half of the time you'd win 1,000. Half of the time you'd win 0, you'd average out to be 500. On the bottom, obviously, your average is 500 too. So from a pure economic perspective, you shouldn't have a preference, right? You should sit on your hands and say they're both the same. Clearly, people don't do that. Most people have a very strong preference for option B, which gives us a sense that people are what we call risk averse. People do not like taking risks. And if you want to get them to take risks, you have to really make it worth their while. So if I was to up the stakes for winning ahead to 2,000 or 3,000, now we'd see more hands going up. But it takes that level to have people overcome risk. Okay, second example. I get you back the following week, and I do this even more fun experiment where it's a coin flipping one. But this time, if it's heads, you have to give me $1,000. And let's imagine I have an elaborate system of encouraging you to give me this money, a large man with a steel club, for example. Or if it's tails, you walk away and quits. Or option B is now you can just give me the 500 for sure. Right? We don't have to do any coin flipping, but you're down 500. So now, who would choose option A here now? All right, so now, if you, of course, you can look around, you see there's a lot more people switch to the risk here. So this tells us another additional fact about human decision making. It's not that people are necessarily risk averse, because people are choosing the risky option here, but this demonstrates that people are what we call loss averse. People really don't like losing things for sure, right? It really is painful for you to have to hand over $500 for me. So now it's like, well, what the hell? We might get out of this with 0. So by using many of these examples and doing them in labs and in brain scanners and in various settings, we can start to understand how human decision making typically works, okay? So we're risk averse, we're loss averse. Here's another example, final example of this. So option A is I give you $1,000 today, or option B is you can come back here in 3 months and I'll give you $1,250. All right? Now there's no right or wrong answer here. This is people's preference for discounting rates. But typically people say, I'll take the money now, please. Right? No. Even if you would assume that I will definitely be here in 3 months, people still prefer it today. So I've made a choice there. We can titrate this down to making a choice of I'm not willing to wait 3 months for an additional $250, right? Most people have quite a strong preference for that. I can reformulate this question in a slightly different way. So in a different way, I can say, you can choose option C. I'll give you $1,000 in exactly 1 year from today, 20 June 2020. Or I'll give you $1,250 in 1 year and 3 months. Now, this is the exact same choice in essence, right? Are you willing to wait 3 months for $250? Previously, people say no. Here, people usually say yes. So again, this gives us another little piece of information. It tells us that people have what's called a present bias. And this is very important for issues about climate and environment. People really care about now, and it's much harder for them to get them to care about the future. So that's one set of decision biases that we can track quite well to the brain's valuation system. So this looks like we'll be giving you a test. I won't, but there's various parts of the brain there. So the striatum and amygdala tend to be really important for this kind of valuation. We're learning a lot about how this valuation system works, and there's certain hormones like dopamine that tend to drive these kind of valuations. And to sum up this part, we value more than just payoffs. So we care about more than just the payoffs. We care about things like salience of choices, similarity to previous choices we've made, complexity of choices, emotions play a big role, and so on. There's a new class of motivations that we've started to study in detail now, which is different to just these purely economic. And this is the sense of social motivation. So I show you here, this is a picture of the Netherlands where I live now. This is about as good as it gets in the Netherlands. It's a beautiful, moderately summer's day. It has a moderate ice cream cone. The Netherlands is a modest and moderate place. And you have this beautifully, perfectly flat landscape. So this thing just summarizes my adopted country quite well. But you can see from her face, perhaps, that she doesn't look very happy. And you might wonder, why not, right? This is as good as it gets. Why wouldn't she be happy? But when I show you the rest of the picture, it becomes immediate and compellingly obvious why she's not so happy. And this is a classic case of what we call social comparison. The idea that we value not so much, in addition to how we value it ourselves, we value it often in comparison to what other people have, right? Well-known phenomenon, of course. What's interesting, if we have these people play a game together, a task together later, she tends not to be quite so nice with this guy. If we actually put her in the brain scanner, we can see that her brain valuation system actually goes down as a function of this guy showing up with his traffic cone of goodness here. So these are really important motivations, and I think they're understudied and underappreciated when we're trying to figure out how to get people to plan for the long term. Social motivations are important. Things like fairness are really important, right? If we divide candies amongst two children and they both get the same, everybody's happy. But if we divide them unequally, well, almost everybody's unhappy. Typically, of course, the person who has the advantageous equality is actually okay with this. Like, well, them's the breaks. But of course, the person who's treated unfairly can be quite angry. And we have a way of testing this experimentally that I'll give my last example, as I think it illustrates quite nicely the weight people put on fairness. So this is a Jaap. This is my second most Dutch picture that I own. It's a Jaap by a canal. And in this experiment, you and Jaap will be brought into the lab, and I tell you that it's going to be a money division task. You're going to divide $10 between the two of you. And Jaap is going to suggest a division. So in this case, imagine Jaap says, okay, well, I'm going to keep $8 and I'm going to give you $2, right? And you can imagine for a moment how you'd feel about Jaap in this situation. Now I'm going to ask you to make a decision. I'm going to ask you to make a decision. Do you either accept Jaap's offer or you reject Jaap's offer? Now the key aspect of this is if you accept, he gets 8, you get 2, the game's over, right? You don't get to interact with Jaap again. If you say no, Jaap gets nothing and you get nothing. I take back all the money unless you can come to an agreement. And so the simple question is, do you accept or reject Jaap's offer? Who would reject Jaap's offer here? Okay, so people making a profoundly sane psychological decision, but a profoundly insane economic decision, right? So you're basically saying $2 is worse than no dollars, right? Now, no economic model I'm aware of can account for that. So this is a well-known finding, and we see this all the time. So this is just an example of what happens if Jaap offers you $5, everybody's happy, everybody accepts. But the less money Jaap offers you, the less chance people have of saying yes. So if Jaap offers you $1, people are more likely to say no than yes. So people are saying no to free money to presumably punish Jaap, to make a point, to say I don't want to be involved in this unfair exchange. And we can start to track that feeling of unfairness and injustice to the brain, specifically to this area here called the insula. And that gives us an index of kind of inequality, the degree to which people feel badly treated and unfairly treated in this brain region, and that tends to predict whether people are going to accept or reject. So this is just one example of the type of social motivations we're beginning to map out both psychologically and neurally. Again, we value more than just kind of monetary economic payoffs. We care about other factors such as fairness and equity, as I mentioned. We care about things like trust and reciprocity. We're willing to pay to feel trusted and to be trusted. We're willing to pay to reciprocate favors people place on us. And we care about cooperation. We like cooperation, and it activates many of these brain reward systems I showed earlier. So just to summarize, I think it's really important when we're trying to think about behavior change or long-term planning that we have to really clearly outline the specific decision behavior we're trying to target. And then it's important to understand how we actually make decisions like this in the real world and not just make assumptions about decision making. In individual motivations, we should try and appeal to things like simplicity and habit. And for social motivations, we can appeal to things like social influence and social norms. And I think using these findings can help us develop better long-term policies that will help us enact better behavioral change. So with that, I will thank you all for your attention.
Thanks very much, Alan. Just before Phil takes the stand, I just want to ask, how culturally sensitive is the ultimatum game?
It's incredibly robust, at least in what we might call market economies. So in economies that are, Western market economies, people get reliably extremely upset. We see that time and time again.
Is there any work in non-market economies?
Yeah, and there it's different. So they have different kind of fairness norms. So there are some cultures where the norm is actually to give more than half, and some cultures where the norm is just to keep most. But at least in Europe, North America, Australia, China, Japan, these results are quite robust.
Okay, that's right.
What happens if you change, like one's an old person and one's a young person,
Yeah.
or an important person and a woman or something?
Yeah, so that would. So they're interesting. They're very little gender effects, but there's every other kind of effect. So context is really important here. We've done experiments where we've had people run a 100-meter race beforehand, and whoever wins gets the right to be the proposer. And then people are much more willing to accept less money. So this is really about the perception of fairness and not about kind of financial equity per se. So context plays a really big role in almost anything you can imagine.
I just want to follow up. So if Yup is old, does that mean that people are less willing to take an unfair offer from Yup or more willing?
Yeah, that depends on the particular pairing, and it depends, I think, on individual beliefs. So some people think old people should be respected and treated well, and so if Yup offers me less, it's because he's the elder and deserves more. Some people think I'm a poor student and here's Yup there sitting by his fancy canal, so why doesn't he offer me a little bit more? So that can be quite idiosyncratic across people, the particular pairing.
Interesting. Okay, thanks very much. Our next speaker is Phil Tetlock, who is a professor, rather bewilderingly, I must admit, of democracy, citizenship, psychology, and management. Is that right?
Approximately.
But it's all at the University of Pennsylvania. Do you want to take the lectern, or are you going to?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's fine. Let's go back for a second. How do we go? No, back. Stay here. So I've reached a stage in life where I'm accustomed to being the most ignorant person in the room on the topic at hand. So I'm a generalist. I run forecasting tournaments, and I think it's a safe bet that most of the people in this room know more about climate and energy technology forecasting and atmospheric chemistry than I do. So the question, why bother listening to me at all? And if there's any claim to comparative advantage I might have, it's that I may have an edge in knowing more about the fallibility of human judgment. I've been running forecasting tournaments for about 35 years, just prior to Mikhail Gorbachev becoming General Party Secretary of the Soviet Union, right up to Donald Trump. And one of the more consistent findings coming from work on forecasting tournaments is that subject matter experts tend to be miscalibrated. they're not usually as wildly miscalibrated as the forecasters whom Andrew was talking about earlier in the 1970s, the dramatic doomster forecasts, but they're miscalibrated and pretty significantly. When they say things are 90% likely, things often happen only about 70% of the time, for example. Now, some people have wondered that forecasting is so bad, raises questions about what forecasters are actually trying to do. It may be that there are lots of Kahneman-style cognitive biases that are impediments to being accurate, but maybe forecasters have other agenda in mind. And that brings me to the Dilbert cartoon that came up prematurely. Is it gone? There we go. Okay, I will use up some of my pressure. 25 seconds to read that. Absorb it. Does this resemble anything you've ever seen? The boss is on top of this, and the punchline is, of course, his surprisingly robust argument for evil, and he was barely trying. He was just winding up. But a lot of key ideas are in there. The idea of data overfitting. In our work on forecasting tournaments, the more complex algorithms can win in any given locale, but they don't transfer very well. Accuracy does fall off pretty fast as you move to the 5-year frontier, and which raises deep questions about, well, if you're doing long-range planning and you can't have accurate forecasting, what exactly are you planning for? And then there is this very interesting and very corrupting fusion of facts and values that goes on in forecasting. You don't want to make the wrong mistake. The boss's corrupting remark is, if you can't predict the future, you might as well make predictions that are useful to us, useful to the cause. And I think that you see that form of corruption happening quite frequently in life. I don't know how many of you have ever felt familiar with the Cheney doctrine, the 1% doctrine. He once famously said that it wasn't that he had new facts about WMD in Iraq, it was that he was looking at the same old facts through a new prism, the prism of 9/11. Even if the probability had been as low as 1%, it would have justified an invasion. Now, of course, he didn't feel that way prior to the invasion. He put a lot of pressure on analysts and so forth to pump their probabilities up. But deep down in his heart, he felt that there was an existential threat, to quote unquote, and something had to be done about it. Does that sound familiar? So my first question to the crowd, I guess, is are there versions of the Cheney doctrine alive and well in environmentalism? My second question for you is, that I'd like to crowdsource, is it possible to take the work we've been doing on forecasting tournaments over the last 35 years and bridge shorter term and longer term exercises? And I think the short answer is yes. And it's using a methodology we call Bayesian question clustering. It looks like this. Take a big fuzzy question: will there be widespread autonomous robotic warfare by 2025 or 2050, or whatever, insert whatever date you wish. It's a big question. It's not as precise as the clairvoyance test. And that doesn't pass the clairvoyance test. Now I'm going to give you a series of micro indicators that resolve more rapidly, each of which has some implications for the truth status of the thing in the red circle. Now the numbers that appear by each of the micro questions are called likelihood ratios, and that's critical in Bayesian belief updating for determining how much you should change your mind about the big scenario if the event in the marginal boxes were to occur. So the biggest likelihood ratio is Boston Dynamics Atlas robot completes U.S. Army land navigation course off tether by 2020, likelihood ratio of 2.5. That means if you think this is unlikely and that happens, you should change your mind. A fair amount. Unmanned combat aerial vehicle defeats human pilot in simulated dogfight by 2020. That's the next biggest likelihood ratio. That means you should change your mind. So the question that I was interested in asking Andrew and Victor earlier, is it possible to do a Kahneman-style adversarial collaboration with Bayesian question clusters in which we can figure out who is closer to the truth about the fundamental grounds for optimism or pessimism about environmental trends? And how exactly would you go about doing that? It's something that requires great patience, it requires a lot of trust, because each side needs to be able to agree ex ante on the probative value of the events. They need to agree ex ante on the values of the likelihood ratios. You say, well, you know what, if this were to happen, so Andrew were to say, oh, well, you know, if Trump were to win re-election resoundingly, and if this were to happen and this were to happen, I would downgrade my optimism. Now, this doesn't mean that the techno-optimistic worldview is wrong, but it does mean it's going to be a little bit slower to come to fruition if it does come to fruition. Now, when you're dealing with these really long time ranges in environmental policy, forecasting tournaments are very tricky. I mean, it could be that Andrew could take a beating for 20 years in forecasting tournaments and still be right. You know, there could be a succession of Trumps and there could be a couple of mini nuclear wars, but we're still on this long-term Robert Fogel-style upward trajectory. It's just a little, you know, when they're looking back two or 300 years, they'll say, oh, look at that bump. That'll be us. But during that 20-year period, of course, we'll be frantic. we'll be going bananas. So what I would recommend to you is that forecasting tournaments, I've been doing these both as a basic research effort and sometimes in concert with tournaments sponsored by the US intelligence community focused on things of national security interest, that forecasting tournaments are an effective vehicle for addressing many of the categories of questions you would like to address. But it will take a great deal of patience, it'll take a great deal of trust, and you'll need not to, you don't want to get confused. Even though somebody's losing for a couple of years, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, it doesn't mean they're losing the big debate. But it does mean if they're not willing to change their minds at all in the short to medium term, it casts serious doubt about their willingness to play a scientific game. And I have 12 seconds. I'm going to be finishing.
16 seconds.
Oh,
but
right,
if you want something, if you've got 12 seconds, Phil, give us 12 seconds.
No, it's okay. It's quite all right.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Unless either of you have questions, but I'm not quite sure what your question is and what the import of your question is about the Cheney doctrine for environmentalism. Was it something which a 1% risk of something happening would justify a massive expenditure?
Correct.
Okay.
You were sure. You did know.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to make sure. It seems to me. Okay. I'd be interested. Does anyone want to shout out something at the 1% risk? Okay, those aren't actually things. Well, they are things, but they're not things in the way that I mean things. And what? Sorry? Okay, that's an interesting one. Okay, so we're talking about radical non-linearities. Okay, that's cool. Does anyone else have questions for Phil up here on the panel? Esther, maybe you'd like to speak now. Esther will be known to many of you. She's been a comrade in arms to Stuart for many years, for a significant part of the long now, well, a while anyway. She's now involved in in an initiative called Wellville, which is fostering individual and institutional behavior change. And Esther.
Okay, so I'm number 3 on what I would call the naive observer / out-of-the-box panel, because we're people who don't really do climate change regularly. And I personally, so it's been really interesting to sit here this morning. I wanted to just go back to what Andrew said about dematerialization. And another thing dematerialization does, I think, is make us think shorter term, because everything happens so fast. You can measure things, you can look at your cell phone. It's a very different world from where somebody started work building a cathedral that would be finished when his grandchildren grew up. So going back to what, oh dear, David, no, Alan. My short-term memory is gone. What Alan was talking about, why are some people short-term and why are others long-term? And candidly, why is our society becoming more and more short-term? I don't think it's just dematerialization. So I'm going to put up this chart. Yes, I have agency. Here we go. Oops, it went. There we go. I'm not going to talk about it a lot, but I just want to put it up there for you to keep in the background. Down in the lower left, it's all about me right now. Up, it's the benevolent billionaire, cares about society, gives $100 or $10,000 to a beggar, but has no lasting impact. On the lower right, it's that same billionaire giving $100 million to the cause of longevity for himself, primarily. And in the naturally virtuous upper right-hand corner, it's thinking long-term on behalf of society. And in this talk, I'm going to move mostly from what I call the global we. We need to do this, we need to do that, we all agree that X, as if society actually was unified and consisted of this single mind. It really consists of lots of individuals. And that's where the culture of society, the long-term or short-term thinking begins. So in my remaining 6 minutes, I'm going to talk about what I'm doing now and what I learned. I was a reporter where I learned to ask questions. I studied economics. I did tech stuff for 25 years, trained as a cosmonaut, and started to get interested in healthcare because it just seemed more meaningful and useful than Uber for dogs or whatever. And therefore, because of my training as a journalist, I asked this question. And if you were to talk about it in the context of GDP, as we did this morning, why is healthcare included in the GDP? Because so much of it is really just fixing problems that shouldn't have existed in the first place. So it's kind of negative. It's like policing and jails, it's probably a necessary expense, but if it didn't exist and it didn't need to exist, wouldn't we all be better off? And I thought somebody should really look at this more carefully. What would it take to invest in health as an asset? Just the way you're thinking of investing in the climate as an asset. It's a complex, emergent, whatever system, and it has its own resilience. It ideally goes back to the mean and is self-correcting and homeostatic and all this stuff. That's really what health is. So long story very short, I started what is a 10-year project, not like the long now or anything else. It's not supposed to last. It's supposed to do something for 10 years and ideally finish and then move to a different phase. We work in 5 small communities around the US, under 200,000 each. And it wasn't a nice white lady showed up, picked your community, and she's going to fix you. It was more, here's an application if you're a community that's trying to become healthier. There's a bunch of people who would like to coach you, help connect you to sources of funding, ideas, whatever. 42 communities applied. In 2014, my CEO and I visited 10 of them, picked 5, one of which is near Muskegon, and I've talked to Susie Baker about Muskegon. Looking forward to following up. Another is Lake County, not far north of here, known as the meth capital of California, regularly near the bottom of the county health rankings, troubled place, lots of vets with PTSD. You see them in San Francisco. They're also up there in Lake County, but you don't even see them. And then they had fires 2 years in a row. The second year, it was arson. And here's what I learned. I thought I would be doing good, but I didn't think it would be intellectually very exciting. The chart I'm not showing is the chart showing opioid use, opioid deaths, whatever you want, addiction. And read a whole bunch of books, looked at what I was learning, talked to people, and came to the discovery, fundamentally, addiction is the very extreme down in that lower left corner of I want it, I want only it, I have no perspective, and I want it now. It's not about fulfillment of desire. It's that desire itself that just consumes you. How do you get to that point? So much of it depends on the first few years of childhood training. And we're talking about neuroscience and AI. We're using neuroscience to understand AI better, but you can also use AI to understand neuroscience better. And for the techies in the room, what we fundamentally want to do is help improve the training set for children, infants, who are going to be the humans and the long thinkers, ideally, of tomorrow. If your life is insecure, unpredictable, you're subject to abuse, of course you're going to take the marshmallow now in favor of 2 marshmallows later. Why should you trust the investigator? Why should you trust Alan that he's going to give you $250 later? Just grab it now while you can. And that becomes a pathology. You can look at brain waves, and you can see it neurologically. You can certainly see it in behavior. You can see it vis-a-vis substances and opioids, but you can also see it vis-a-vis cell phones, sex addiction, food addiction. I used to think Facebook addiction was a clever metaphor, but now I believe it's something real. The second thing we discovered is that it's not just individuals that get addicted, but many of the organizations we work with are addicted to short-term results, to pilot programs, to grants. We've got a part-time coordinator. Somebody's offering funding for a women's ballet class. Let's do it. Next year, it's after-school swimming for the children, or who knows, a project to study nutrition in 5-year-olds. Whatever it is, we'll take it because we've got this foundation and it needs to be funded, as opposed to building long-term institutions that will last. So in our communities, we need the institutions to help change the behavior of the individuals. But we also need the individuals in those institutions to start thinking long-term. My time is up, and I would much rather answer questions than come up with a beautiful conclusion, because all we have so far is questions. Thank you.